Welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. And we're going to just fix one mic issue. Thank you so much. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk is entitled Communicating Atrocity, Memorializing Traumatic Histories, and features Dr. Amy Sodaro. The event is part of the 2024-25 Kupferberg Holocaust Center and National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium, Circuitous Exchanges, in collaboration with Unseen Threads, a partnership between the KHC and Queensborough's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center, also known as the TRHT. Established at Queensborough in 2021, the TRHT is one of 72 such centers nationwide dedicated to challenging biases and fostering the development of leaders who are committed to creating more equitable communities. The Unseen Threads program focused on increasing understanding of the historical and contemporary links between anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination and hate to foster deeper understanding of these issues and support meaningful changes. 3 separate cohorts spent a day at the KHC, followed by a trip to Montgomery, Alabama, to visit the Equal Justice Initiative's 3 legacy sites: the Legacy Museum, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and the Freedom Monument Sculpture Park. These sites are, quote, in a region that once held the largest population of enslaved Black people and would later become the heart of the civil rights movement, unquote. This is Dr. Sodaro's second presentation this semester at the KHC. Her first talk, Communicating the Past, Exhibiting the Holocaust in Memorial Museums, focused on the evolving ways in which the Holocaust is represented in museums and the challenges ahead in communicating this history to new generations. You can find the link for this recorded event in the Zoom chat right now, as well as on the KHC's website. Today's event is co-sponsored by 7 organizations around the country. They include the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Reeves Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, and the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University. I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to Queensborough Community College President Christine Mangino and Amadis Matos, Queensborough's Assistant Vice President for Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, who spearheaded the Unseen Threads initiative. We're also grateful for the support of our QCC colleagues who are integral in producing today's hybrid event. They include Stephen DiDio, Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer, Barana Soman, the KHC's Administrative Coordinator, Jesse Pina from Media Services, Phil Roncaroni from Communications, and Maher Hussein from the Strategic Initiatives and Digital Transformation Department. After Dr. Sodaro's presentation today, we'll host a short Q&A. For those of you watching online, please submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Danny Sexton, one of this year's KHC NEH Faculty Fellows. He'll moderate, and he is an associate professor here in the English department at Queensborough. He's published on Victorian and African American literature, as well as on issues of race, gender, masculinity, and pedagogy, and is currently working on a book about the literary representation of all Black towns and communities. Dr. Sexton, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Let me begin by introducing our speaker, Dr. Amy Sodaro, who is an associate professor of sociology at the City University of New York, Borough Manhattan Community College. She received her PhD in sociology from the New School for Social Research with a focus on cultural sociology and memory studies. Her research focuses on memorization of past violence in memorial museums. She's the co-editor of Museums and Sites of Persuasion, Politics, Memory, and Human Rights, 2019, and edited Museums and Mass Violence, 2025. She is the editor of the Sage Journal, Memory Studies, and co-chair of the Memory Studies Association Museums and Memory Working Group. Her work perfectly aligns with the colloquium that we're doing this semester. And I just want to highlight just a little bit of her two most recent publications that are really in line with what we're doing for this academic year. The first one is Exhibiting Atrocity, which she explores the history of a number of global memorial museums, such as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., the Budapest Terrorháza, House of Terror, Kigali Genocides Memorial Center, the National September 11 Memorial Museum. And what she does is she put these memorial museums in dialogue with one another, exploring and investigating the intentions behind their creations, analyzing how their exhibitions present the past through various strategies, and examining the museum as public institutions in order to understand how they attempt to engage communities in discussion about the past. Her latest work, Lifting the Shadow, Reshaping Memory, Race, and Slavery in U.S. Museums, 2025, is she turns her focuses to 3 new U.S. memorial museums: the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in D.C., Montgomery's Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, and Greenwood Rising, which commemorates the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, that focuses on slavery and its ongoing violent legacies. She puts these 3 museums in dialogue with one another, exploring their intentions, analyzing their exhibitions, and putting them in dialogue with a sense of the global memorial museums. As I stated earlier, her work aligns perfectly with the theme of our colloquium, and it's with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Amy Sodaro.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen and Dr. Sexton, for these really generous introductions. Sorry, let me see if I can figure out how to. Is this good? Oh, wait, no, I didn't share my screen. Sorry, everybody, while I try to figure out how to. Yep. Okay. Are we good? All right. Anyway, thank you so much for these really kind introductions and for inviting me here to the Kupferberg Center and Queensborough Community College. It's really a pleasure to be here for the second time this year, and I'm honored to be speaking to all of you. And as has been mentioned, this afternoon I'm going to be talking about the parallels and interconnections between Holocaust memorialization and memorialization of slavery and its legacies of violence in the United States today. And this is a really important moment for thinking about commemoration. Am I okay? Sorry. Okay, thanks. I'm sorry. Technical issues. Anyway, so this is a very important moment to think about commemoration of the Holocaust. And I was here speaking specifically about Holocaust memorialization in January. As you all probably know, this year is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And the further we get from the Holocaust in history, and the more living memory of the Holocaust disappears, these memory institutions are only going to become more and more important. And these are the places where this memory will be carried on to future generations. But as you also know, it's also a really critical moment for thinking about the commemoration of slavery and its legacies in the United States. In the last decade, and this was really the context in which I wrote my second book that Dr. Sexton mentioned, we've experienced what memory scholars study Jeff Olick has referred to as a mnemonic turn in the US, with Confederate statues being removed and with kind of a wave of efforts to commemorate slavery and its legacies in kind of newly critical ways. But with this kind of memory momentum has come a pretty severe backlash, and that's picked up in recent months. Especially with the new administration seeking to limit any kind of teaching or discourse or policy related to acknowledging and writing this past. And as you probably have seen, just like the end of last week, Trump signed an executive order that is titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, that is intended to, and I'm quoting from the executive order, restore federal sites to solemn and uplifting public monuments that remind Americans of our extraordinary heritage, consistent progress toward becoming a more perfect union, and unmatched record of advancing liberty, prosperity, and human flourishing. So you can imagine what this is going to mean for sites that commemorate or in some way address slavery. So as has been mentioned, in January I gave a talk here on Holocaust memorialization and the emergence of a new kind of memorial museum paradigm that has spread around the world and is used globally to commemorate the Holocaust and other kinds of atrocities and violence. And so in many ways what I'm doing here today is kind of going to pick up where that talk left off and think about how Holocaust commemoration has shaped memorialization of slavery in the US today and what this might mean sort of moving forward for American efforts to confront this past. And so I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of background on the emergence of memorial museums out of Holocaust commemoration, talk a little bit about their spread around the world and some of the practices that have emerged with this new form of commemoration. And then I'll shift to thinking about how this paradigm has been recently used in the US to remember slavery and its legacies. Let me see how how am I advancing my slides here? Oh, there we go. Okay, got it. And so the origins of memorial museums can really be traced to the very earliest efforts to commemorate the Holocaust. And this started even before the war ended on the sites of the atrocities. And in the wake of the war, as the camps were liberated, survivors of the camps, the troops who liberated them, erected makeshift memorials that were intended to commemorate those who had perished on these sites, but also to preserve evidence of what had happened and to document the Nazi crimes. And so very soon after the liberation, memorials emerged on these sites. For example, in 1947, a museum opened at Auschwitz, even though you could already visit the site in 1945 as kind of a memory site and museum. And so it's this dual function of commemoration of the victims and acknowledgement and remembrance of those who lost their lives, and education about and preservation of evidence of the violence that I believe continues to shape commemoration today. And so these impulses that we saw kind of in the immediate aftermath of World War II to commemorate and to educate shaped memorialization far from the scene of the Holocaust. Yad Vashem opened in Israel in 1953 as is Israel's official Holocaust memorial. And in the US in 1993, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum opened. It had been 15 years in the making with lots of deliberation over what an appropriate American memorial to the Holocaust would look like. And in many ways, I see the US Holocaust Memorial Museum as a model for the memorial museum paradigm. It was the first self-described memorial museum. Its creators put a lot of energy into thinking about how to weave history and memory together in a way that would be very powerful for visitors to the site and carry some of the messages that they wanted the museum to convey. And so in my work and in my writing and my thinking about memorial museums, I use the US Holocaust Memorial Museum as kind of the model for this paradigm of memorialization that has spread around the globe. And so much of my research, as Dr. Sexton mentioned, has focused on the global spread of memorial museums as a new form of commemoration. That started with Holocaust commemoration, but that's been adapted and adopted to different historical and social contexts around the world. And these are just a few images of the museums that I wrote about in my first book in Hungary and Rwanda and Chile, and the 9/11 Museum in Lower Manhattan. And in that book and in my research in general, I argue that memorial museums are this relatively new form of commemoration that is considered to be increasingly important for societies that want to confront and try to come to terms with past violence. And they're created to serve multiple purposes. They're intended to educate about the past. They're intended to generate historic dialogue. They're intended to counter claims of denial. So again, to sort of preserve and display the evidence of what happened. They perform a memorial function of acknowledging and commemorating victims. And they have some kind of loftier goals, too. They're intended to promote reconciliation and human rights and to contribute to the prevention of future violence. And so they have this kind of diverse set of goals and functions that they set for themselves. And to fulfill these functions, they kind of straddle different commemorative forms. They are hybrid institutions. And so they're part history museum, where they use historical narrative and history-telling practices to teach about the past, to present and preserve evidence from the past. But they're also memorial institutions, and they infuse this history with memory that's intended to commemorate the victims, but to also provide an affective, emotional experience for visitors. And they weave history and memory together in this way with the goal of moral transformation. So their hope is that visitors will visit this museum, they'll learn about the past, they'll have an emotional encounter with the past, and they will come away in some way morally transformed to embrace an ethic of never again. And so to perform these functions and to try to fulfill these goals, memorial museums use a set of tropes or practices that have really kind of developed and hardened over the decades since they emerged. Many of these are probably familiar to those of you who have visited memorial museums around the world. And they're sort of believed to be very effective in working toward these goals of education, commemoration, and transformation. And so I'm going to just move quickly through these different practices, sort of pulling out some of the key ones, looking at how they're used in Holocaust museums especially, and then I'll shift to think about how these practices have been adopted in the US context. And so one of the key modes of trying to inspire moral transformation is what we can think about as affective architecture. And this is a term that comes from genocide scholar Rebecca Jinks, who has argued, and I'm quoting her here, that it's a new commemorative aesthetic where the interior space and decoration of the building is designed in order to elicit certain sensory and emotional reactions which chime with the exhibition or memorial's content and intended meaning. And so this kind of affective architecture is used in museums around the world, and this is just a few examples of Holocaust museums that employ this kind of architecture. And it's intended to create particular experiences for visitors. So in Holocaust museums, we often see these kind of sharp angles and voids, juxtapositions of space that are intended to disorient visitors as they move through the building and the exhibits. But they also tend to use light and glass as kind of symbolic of the teleological tales and messages that they're trying to convey to their visitors about a more peaceful and bright future. And so with and within this effective architecture, memorial museums try to create exhibits that give visitors an experience. So the architecture contributes to this, but the exhibits themselves are also intended to give visitors experiential encounters that can kind of take them on a journey through the past, and that's emotional and affective. And again, here I see the Holocaust Museum as a model. As I mentioned, a lot of thought went into how it could be the kind of institution its creators wanted it to be. And one of the one of the things that they kind of landed on was that it had to give visitors a very good sense of what the Holocaust was like to experience. And so this is the project director, making the argument that if visitors could take the same journey as victims, they would have this deeper understanding of the story because they will have experienced it themselves. And so memorial museums create for visitors an experience. They take them on a journey through the past. They bring them kind of up close with encounters from the past, with the goal that visitors will in some way kind of create their own memories of that past. And this is something memory studies scholar Alison Landsberg has theorized as prosthetic memory. So when visitors take on a memory of a past that they did not experience, but that they feel kind of as if it's their own past. And so this, goal of having memorial museums experience, having visitors to memorial museums experience the past and take on this prosthetic memory is intended to help these visitors develop empathy with the victims and identification with the individuals who have suffered. And so another practice of memorial museums that's intended to help kind of create this empathic relationship and make visitors identify with the victims is by demonstrating the individuality of victims, trying to kind of move away from the shocking numbers of individuals who are harmed to thinking about the victims as individuals. Visitors are kind of expected to be in a position of bearing witness to the individual lives that were taken as a kind of ethical act that will help move them to some kind of moral and social transformation. And so one of the key ways that the individuality of victims is shown in memorial museums is through the display of victim photographs. And arguably, this kind of started with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Tower of Faces, which displays around 1,000 photographs of a Jewish shtetl in Lithuania before the Holocaust. And so it captures the individuals who lived in this village, who were murdered in the Holocaust. It captures them in life and reminds visitors that all of those nameless, faceless victims that we hear about, in fact, had names and faces and lives and vitality that was snuffed out in the violence. And so most Holocaust and other memorial museums display photos of the victims as part of their efforts to encourage this kind of identification and empathy. And together with photos, personal belongings are also often displayed. Many of you have probably visited Holocaust museums and seen the piles of shoes or the piles of suitcases, which kind of perform a dual function. On the one hand, you can look at the individual names on suitcases or the individual shoe and feel a connection to that individual, but on the other hand, the scale of these belongings, especially when they're displayed en masse, reminds one of the scale of the atrocity. And so at once conveying, the individuality and the massive scale of violence. Together with the display of photographs and personal belongings, another way of trying to encourage empathy and identification with the victims of violence is the display of witness testimony. And so this really has its start with Holocaust testimony. The idea is that if we can hear from the people who experienced the past themselves, we get kind of a window into that past, and bearing witness to this testimony is a kind of ethical position to put the visitor into. And witness testimony, which of course started with these massive archives of Holocaust oral histories that are displayed in many Holocaust museums, but has kind of moved on to become increasingly a central part of memorial museums. So museums around the world work on collecting testimony of survivors and witnesses to the violence, and they display that in many ways as an object in and of itself that can help represent these violent pasts, bring visitors closer to an understanding of what happened in the past, and encourage some kind of empathy and identification. However, and again, this is an example of how the Holocaust is leading the way, as fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors are able to share their testimony, groups and museums and organizations have been looking for ways to kind of capture the power of their testimony in a way that will outlast the survivors themselves. And so new projects are being developed. One of them is pictured here. This is Dimensions in Testimony, and some of you have probably seen or heard of. They're often called Holocaust survivor holograms. They're not actually holograms, but they're high definition recordings of survivors, and they're incredibly sophisticated, and you can have conversations with these survivors. They can answer hundreds of questions in my experience. And so this is an effort to kind of capture the power of that testimony in a way that will last forever and ensure that future generations have access to it. And then sort of the last practice or trope that I'll just touch on is the interactive components that these museums often include. Often these are really sort of simple ways of having visitors reflect on what they've experienced. So they might be asked to write on a Post-it and stick it up on a wall for other visitors to take a look at. In other cases, they're very sophisticated and use these digital technologies, but often memorial museums will seek to ask visitors to think about what they have learned and make some kind of commitment to future action or reflect on how learning about the past might impact them in the present and for the future. And so again, these are just a couple of examples of the more sort of technologically sophisticated ones. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum had an exhibit where visitors learned about genocide around the world and then were invited to write down kind of a commitment to preventing violence and working toward tolerance. And their responses were posted on a wall, and there was like a website that you could access with them. And the other example here is the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, where there's a whole like social lab where visitors can discuss these kinds of ethical issues in this really like high-tech environment. And so all of these exhibition practices are intended to help memorial museums fulfill their primary goal of morally transforming their visitors. And this paradigm, working toward this goal of never again, has been very popular. The Memorial Museum Forum has spread around the world, and it's used to commemorate all kinds of violence and atrocity. And these are just remarks that Bill Clinton made at the opening of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, I think really speaking to this idea and this hope that these museums can mobilize morality in a way that will create a better present and future. And yet, as I think has been mentioned, when I wrote my first book, I included 2 case studies of US memorial museums, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and the 9/11 Museum in Lower Manhattan. But as I was writing my book and in the throes of finishing it, there still wasn't a museum focused on slavery in the US that was kind of the same level of national prominence as these big, elaborate memorial museums that I was writing about. And so that was kind of a huge gap in American memory that I noted and wrote about in my first book, and that's begun to change. And so I'm now going to shift to think about how this paradigm of Holocaust memorialization has been adapted in the US to what I'm conceiving of as like a new set of American memorial museums that look at slavery and its legacies in more critical ways. And I'm going to really focus on the sites in Montgomery. So just to give a super quick background, African American history is kind of woefully underrepresented in history and heritage sites. A recent-ish analysis found that only 3% of the 100,000 sites listed on the National Register of Historic Places are associated with African Americans. Nevertheless, African American museums have a long history in this country. Today, there are over 300 museums of African American history and culture in the US. And they developed in stages that have been really written about this. Scholars who have written kind of most about this are Robin Autry and Andrea Burns. And so kind of the first phase of development of African American museums was in the 1960s, and these were primarily neighborhood museums that were created in and for African American communities in the United States. So they were very much meant to kind of counter the hegemonic white history and culture encountered in mainstream museums, but intended very much for the communities that created them. The second phase occurred in the 1980s and 90s, and this phase, many of the museums developed during this time were part of urban renewal projects, and many of these museums were really intended to commemorate and celebrate the civil rights movement. And so these museums were in many ways focused on civil rights and kind of this narrative of progress in the United States to, a better society that we're living in today. And so even when these museums remembered race and slavery and its legacies, it's often framed in terms of racial progress and triumph over adversity, and kind of framed in a way that fits with the broader American narratives and myths of, freedom and progress and so on. However, this has begun to change. I forgot I have a little quote here from Robin Autry about these uplifting narratives of progress resonating with American values and norms. And so this has begun to change with this new set of museums that I think represent a new form of American memorial museum that turns a more critical eye on this past. And as I said, I'm going to focus on the Montgomery Museum especially, but the Montgomery sites. If I have a little time, sorry, I'm not keeping enough an eye on time, but if I have some time, I'll just say a little bit about the other museums that I wrote about, and I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. Because I think that all of these museums reflect this new American memorial museum paradigm that has emerged. But the museums in Montgomery, I think, first of all, I know many of you have visited, and so I'll be really excited to hear your thoughts. But also, I think, show very clear reference to Holocaust memorialization. And you can see that here in this quote from Brian Stevenson, who is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, which created the legacy sites in Montgomery. And he's been very open about drawing on inspiration from around the world in terms of commemorating violent pasts. And he talks about, going to South Africa, seeing the Apartheid Museum, going to Europe and especially Germany and seeing Holocaust memorials and museums, and his realization that we didn't have anything like that here. Sort of the same thing I mentioned, realizing as I was writing my book, we didn't have any of these sort of nationally prominent sites that look at our own, American violent pasts. And so in 2018, the Equal Justice Initiative opened the first two legacy sites, which I'll talk about, the memorial and the museum. In 2024, the sculpture park followed. The Equal Justice Initiative is a legal advocacy group, so most of the work that they do is fighting injustice in what they refer to as the criminal legal system. I think they don't even want to consider justice in the system because it's very unjust. And so through this work that they were doing in the present, fighting injustice and racism in our legal system, they realized that the roots go so deep that to really be able to do the work that they're doing today, they needed to begin to deepen our understanding of this past and sort of begin to dismantle the narratives that have hardened into the kinds of inequalities that we find today. And so they created these sites that focus on this history that are intended to be public-facing ways of educating Americans about this past that has been so little remembered and little told. And so in 2018, they opened the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is often colloquially referred to as the Lynching Memorial. And it commemorates over 4,000 people who were killed in racial terror lynchings in the South and across the country. And that's another myth that they seek to shatter, that it was not just in the South that lynching occurred, but all over the country. And the memorial is made up of these 800 corten steel columns, each of which represents a county in which a lynching occurred. The column has the county name on it, the date, the name of the person lynched. In some cases, it's many. I don't know if you can sort of see. Some of these have more names than others. And so once it shows kind of the individuality, but the scale of lynching in this country. The information about these lynchings comes from EJI's research on the topic. They set out to document lynching in America and initially documented over 4,000, which are commemorated in the memorial. Since the memorial opened, they've documented an additional 2,500 or so lynchings. And so, the memorial is based in this research that EJI has done. And when you enter the memorial, the columns are bolted to the ground, and so you're kind of walking through them. And as you move through it, the floor of the memorial drops, and soon they're hanging over the visitor. And in this way, they evoke, the bodies of the lynched that are hanging over, what were often like crowds of giddy people enjoying the spectacle. And it's a very powerful and moving memorial, and I think it's made even more so because it is commemorating this past that has for so long been silenced and forgotten in the United States. But it is also the commemorative language that it uses that makes it so powerful, and it very clearly is inspired by Holocaust memorialization. In particular, Berlin's Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, which opened in 2005 as Germany's kind of de facto national Holocaust memorial. Stevenson cites the memorial as a direct inspiration for the Montgomery Memorial. And you can see just from these images that both memorials use a very similar form of affective architecture with the abstraction of the columns and the stelae in the Berlin Memorial, kind of combined with the scale of the memorials that create this very affective encounter for visitors who are invited to walk, between the columns and kind of contemplate, the memory and meaning of what, of these forms of violence. And of course, there are many differences. The Montgomery one is very much adapted for the American context. But the influence and kind of the through line is very clear to see. And both are very clearly, created to give these affective experiences. But as with the Berlin Memorial, the sort of abstraction of the architecture can only go so far in kind of explaining the history and educating about it. And so in Berlin, there's an underground information center that has exhibits that tell kind of a fuller story of the Holocaust. And in Montgomery, there is the nearby Legacy Museum, which kind of fills in the history and situates lynching within this longer history of racial injustice in the United States. And in the Legacy Museum, I think, again, there are these references to Holocaust memorialization. And so the Legacy Museum, like other memorial museums, takes visitors on kind of a historical journey, and it's intended to weave together historical education and memory in a way that is effective and that is intended to inspire moral transformation. And as the name tells you, the museum makes the argument that slavery did not end, but evolved into lynching, into segregation, and into today's system of mass incarceration. And so it's telling this very long history of racial injustice in the United States, kind of anchored by this timeline that takes visitors through these 4 different eras of racial injustice: slavery, lynching, segregation, and mass incarceration. And so I'm just going to touch on a few ways that sort of reference to Holocaust memorialization is present in the museum, but I'm sure there are many others that we can talk about if there are thoughts on this. And so one way, that we see this reference to Holocaust and memorial museums is through the kind of immersive experiential encounters that the Legacy Museum creates. And one example of this, which I think is one of the really kind of powerful experiential examples, is the Slave Pens exhibit, which not only creates this immersive encounter, but also draws on the trope of testimony to try to give voice to the victims who have been long silenced in our history. And so I see some of you nodding, you've seen this, but for those of you who haven't, it's a long, dark hallway that's lined with cells, and when the visitor approaches a cell, a sort of holographic spectral image of an enslaved person kind of appears and tells a really harrowing story about the slave auction and family separation and the traumas of this particular part of slavery. And there are a number of different cells and stories that the visitor hears. Once the visitor walks away, the image disappears until the next person arrives. And in this way, I think, the intent is to give visitors, an encounter with the past, hear from the voice of somebody whose voice has been lost in a way that will inspire, empathy, identification, and really move visitors. But unlike with Holocaust testimony, with the exception of the Slave Narrative Project, there is very little testimony of those who were enslaved, and certainly not video testimony. And so in this case, the museum uses that sort of new technology that's being employed with these holographic images of people from the past telling, stories that have long been lost to history. Just as the Legacy Museum doesn't have a lot of testimony to draw on and to display, it also does not have many objects at all. The museum is primarily, it tells its story through text and reproductions of documents and photographs, and there are very few objects that are on display. There are some, and one of the most powerful sort of set of objects in the museum is this display of 800 jars of soil that were dug up at the sites of lynching across the South and the US. And as you can see from this image, so each jar has the county and the date and the name of the person who was lynched, although many of them are unknown. Each jar of soil is a different color, right? There's this tremendous variety. And so at once there's, as with the personal belongings that are displayed in Holocaust museums, a sense of the individuality of these people who were lynched on these sites, but also the scale, this sort of staggering scale, especially if you keep in mind that this is 800 jars of soil out of what is now a documented 6,500 lynchings in the United States. So, again, displaying kind of the individuality, but also the sense of the mass scale of violence. But the jars of soil, I think, also represent something that's really important that the museum does, which is this kind of interjection of the past into the present. Many people believed or still believe that lynching is something that should be, continue to be buried in our past, that shouldn't be publicly acknowledged and thought about and talked about. And the soil kind of literally digs up this past that we have tried to forget in this country for so long, and prominently displays it in a way, that you can't really look away and unknow. In one of the more kind of familiar displays in the museum, and I think the whole section on segregation in many ways is the most familiar probably to those of you who have visited civil rights museums. But we see the trope of victim photographs, in this case in the big, huge display of the over 80 individuals who were arrested for the Montgomery bus boycotts. And so this kind of takes this trope and displays it on this mass scale, again, kind of playing with scale and individuality. And in the Legacy Museum, this is one of the few places where the visitor gets kind of a slightly more hopeful narrative where, you can sort of reflect on changes that, events like the Montgomery bus boycott were able to make to the society that we live in. And again, kind of thinking about this temporal line, from past to present. But that kind of hope that comes out of the civil rights displays in the museum is kind of shattered when in the final section of the museum where this connection between past and present is kind of brought home. And this is the section on mass incarceration. And so in this part of the exhibit is the Legacy Museum's version of testimony where you can sit down, pick up a phone, read through the list of rules in a prison visitation center that the visitor must follow, and then speak to an individual. But in this case, it's not voices from the past that are addressing the visitor. It's people who are currently or have been very recently caught up in our system of mass incarceration. And the stories that they tell are just as harrowing as those stories from the past, like really horrifying stories of the kinds of violence and abuse and injustice that occurs in our criminal legal system. Only in this case, you don't have time as the buffer, right? These are people who are talking to you in the now. And so, as just these few images and descriptions, I think, show, the Legacy Museum tells this really unrelenting story of the past and ongoing racial injustice and violence in the US. And the hope is, of course, that visitors come away moved to kind of, our own American version of Never Again, which EJI writes and talks about as repairing the painful legacies of racial injustice in the United States. And there's this kind of memorial room that is like one of your final chances for contemplation. The walls are lined with photos of racial justice advocates, and music plays, and visitors kind of invited to think about what they have learned and kind of actions that they might take to work toward a better present and future. Now, I will just say whether and to what extent visitors are kind of internalizing this message of Never Again isn't yet clear, but the museum and the memorial have been really incredibly popular, which I think gives us room for hope. I don't think I have time. If anyone wants to talk about the other museums, we can definitely talk about them in the Q&A. And I'll just sum up by saying that we're in this very precarious time, but I think in part, actions like the executive order related to the Smithsonian just remind us of how important this memory and history is. And so that gives me hope that these museums will continue to do this really important work, telling the truth about this past in ways that will hopefully move visitors to work for a better present and future. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to questions, comments, et cetera.
Thank you. You can stay.
Should I stay?
Yeah, and I'll just ask questions. I have one question, and you did touch upon this a little bit, and I just wanted to maybe just see if you can expand on it. I'm very curious about that intersection between history and memory, right? Because there's a distinction between the two, but you did mention and alluded to how these museums attempt to address both of these. And so maybe just kind of, as you understand it, the difference between history and memory, and then how these memorial museums are negotiating between these two.
Yeah, definitely. And there's like quite a broad literature on, history and memory and the divide, and how it plays out in spaces like museums. History, as we all probably know, has long been thought of as kind of more objective, more stable, less subject to like the variance of memory and the fragility of memory. And so I think in many ways our ideas about history have been kind of shattered in recent decades as people realize that history is also, subject to political, social, cultural framing. But in museums, I think memory is often kind of inserted as a corrective to the limitations, the perceived limitations of history. So as I've said, memorial museums, their goal is to inspire some kind of moral transformation and to move people in emotional and affective ways, to take on some kind of like ethical position in society. And history, while you can learn a lot through like historical narrative, the creators of these museums think that, infusing those sort of more objective, well-documented narratives with individual stories, with experiential encounters, will make that history learning that much more impactful. I think there's also kind of a temporal difference between how we think about history and memory, and like history sort of being about the past and memory taking place in the present. And so I think especially in museums like the Legacy Museum that are trying to make this connection between past and present, I think memory becomes very important so that you're not tempted to assume that, lynching is in the past. It's behind us, right? But reminding us that, the legacies and even practices of lynching continue in the present. And so I think that temporal dimension is important too.
Thank you. Are there any questions from any of our participants?
Hi, this is a wonderful presentation. I love the concept of mobilizing morality. And I'm wondering if you have come across any examples of how morality has been mobilized in a way that that affects immediate change, right? Like, are there some examples perhaps from the Holocaust museums that exist, or, outside of academia, right? Because we'll leave and we'll write something.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if we've seen any historical documentation of immediate impact, maybe politically or even in these kinds of sites leading to some immediate action.
Yeah, I mean, this is, those of us who study these kinds of museums are always kind of running up against this question, right? Like, what do these museums really do? They say they're going to do all these really important things, but do they? And so I can't think of many examples of sort of very immediate action. One example that comes to mind, and this is kind of a faraway example, is, and I think this speaks to sort of different levels on which these museums are created and function. And this is the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, South Africa, which was created in a neighborhood, District 6, which had been razed under apartheid, and it was a mix of, it was mostly a colored neighborhood, and people were removed from the neighborhood and sent to live in the township so that this could be like a whites-only neighborhood. And the community came together and created a museum in District 6. And all of the former inhabitants were still living nearby and would come and contribute to the museum. And the museum became kind of, it was part of an activist movement and became like a hub for this kind of activism. And there were like land restitution hearings at the museum, fighting to like get land back to the people who had lived in District 6. And so I think that is maybe one example of like the museum, as a kind of hub for activism at the community level. Very sort of different from like state or national museums that I think are really constrained by politics and funding and issues like that. But I think it raises a really important question about like museums and activism, and I think that's part of why the Legacy Museum and the legacy sites are so effective, is because they're not just standalone historic sites, but they're part of like the bigger work that EJI is doing. Certainly the legal work that EJI is doing, but they also have a community remembrance project which goes into communities around the country to help remember and acknowledge lynching and racial violence in those communities. And so I think, like museums, when they are just museums, I think are often very constrained in the kind of like action that they can inspire. But I think when they're tied to some kind of activist project, there's more potential for real change. And I'll just like super quickly, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum has like a whole genocide prevention center, like an advocacy center, and they're always like making statements. And generally it doesn't go anywhere because they're still very much like a historical museum that focuses on the Holocaust and is so constrained by politics. So,
well, as a follow-up, do these projects sometimes measure impact through reflection?
Like visitor reflection, yeah. This is one of those things that like drives us crazy. The people who like study these sites. To varying degrees. So most of these museums, unfortunately, will not allow outside researchers in to like do visitor studies and try to like measure, the impact of these museums on visitors. And the way to really do it would have to be like a longitudinal study where you like talk to visitors 6 months after, a year after. And so there's very little of that. To varying degrees, some of these museums try to do that work and try to like measure the impact that they have on visitors. And certainly in the immediate like time frame following a visit, most visitors to these kinds of museums will say that they're moved and like spurred to some kind of action. But how sustainable that is, I think, is really just like an open question. So yeah, we're all trying to get at that and can't figure out quite how. Yeah.
Thank you for a really thoughtful presentation. I couldn't help but wonder, museums are such static spaces, meaning it's happened. And how cool would it be, or maybe there are some institutions that have almost like a futures project where we at the end of this, experience, particularly if you're empathetic and you felt some things and you need a moment, how do you plan for tomorrow? And so what's cool about a Futures Project, as you know, is not just about us, but it's about our children's children. And when leaving Alabama, outside of the Legacy Museum, there's a beautiful portrait of these beautiful black smiling children, and it says that this work is for the children of these children. And so how powerful would it be to dream about our children's children and the future we can imagine for them, knowing our history?
Yeah.
So, is anyone thinking like that, or are they just...
I mean, I think, I showed the one slide with like these spaces that are created in these museums where you can like write down a commitment, right? But I don't see that going anywhere sort of in any tangible way. And I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but the museum in Tulsa tries to do this. It was very much inspired by the museum in Montgomery, and it kind of checks all the boxes of what a memorial museum should do. And they have this like commitment wall where you write a commitment to racial justice. And they have like a dialogue space with all these big questions that visitors are supposed to talk about. And kind of none of it happens. And you just like leave the museum, and they haven't given you any tools for like how to make real change. And that museum is interesting because it's been very controversial among the African American community, because many people see it as just kind of a symbolic gesture and not really tied to any meaningful efforts at change, especially in Tulsa, where reparations and restitution was never paid to victims and survivors of the Tulsa race massacre. And so there, it seems to me, it could be really concrete, right? Like you're leaving the museum and maybe there's a QR code that you scan that tells you how to contribute to a restitution fund, that tells you about activist organizations that are doing this work, and they don't have anything. They don't give you like any tools to kind of take away. And so I think that's a huge gap in these museums, and maybe something that like as they work to make these connections between past and present, maybe then the next step is to the future. Not a very satisfactory answer, I know.
I'd just like to ask one question from online. Someone asked, or she started off with, I've also observed art is significant in Holocaust museums. She speaks about one that she visited in Lithuania. And she said, can you please address the value of art in this and other memorials? And one of the ones that she names as an example is the apartheid memorial in South Africa.
Yeah, so the power of art in these museums. And I didn't even mention this, but the Legacy Museum has an art gallery that's attached. That's actually the last thing that you visit in the museum. And I'm now forgetting, there's a big quote on the wall. I don't know if anyone remembers. I think Brian Stevenson had a conversation with somebody about the power of art in in memory and history, and ensuring that these connections are made between past and present. And art is also incorporated through all of the exhibits in the Legacy Museum. So in addition to the historical narratives and storytelling, there are artworks in like all of the different exhibition galleries. Memorial museums in general tend to incorporate a lot of artwork. I think the idea that art gives us another language for understanding and thinking about trauma, for coming to terms with trauma and violence, for making connections between certainly past and present, but also between individuals across cultures and time and space. And so I think art is certainly part of this paradigm of remembrance that's used to varying degrees in the kinds of museums that I've studied. But I think generally considered to be another way, a sort of additional way of trying to convey these messages and do these things that memorial museums are trying to do.
And I'd like to ask one more question from an online participant. writes, memorial museums and monuments can cut the other way by rehabilitating perpetrators and erasing history. This was done in the US, but are especially evident in Turkey and Russia. Memorial museums that attempt more transformations must be cognizant of the counter-narratives being created by the perpetrators. And the person just asked, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of us who study memory and even museums kind of got into this thinking about memory always as kind of, progressive, liberal ways of like addressing the problems of the past in a way intended to, progress to a better future. But I think we've all realized that memory cuts both ways, and memorials and memorial museums do as well. Some of them are really explicitly political. It was on one of the slides, but in my first book I wrote about the House of Terror in Budapest, Hungary, which is supposed to be a museum that remembers communism and fascism in Hungary, but it was created by Viktor Orban now like 15 years ago or something. And it very much focuses on communism and the horrors and traumas of communism and completely downplays fascism and Hungary's role as a collaborator, and very much props up Orban's narrative of the past and present. I mean, the same is true in Rwanda. I mean, the victim-perpetrator dynamic in Rwanda is pretty clear-cut, but Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, has very, very tight control over the narrative of the genocide there, and any kind of deviation from the official narrative is grounds for actual legal punishment in the country, and has also been used to get rid of any opposition to Kagame's regime. And so memory is often used in illiberal ways to, reinforce the status quo, to rehabilitate perpetrators, to rewrite and revise history. And I think we see our present administration working on ways to do that here in this country.
Okay. Do we have any more questions from our audience? No? Let me just ask one more question that I have here. I know we're on time. And I'm going to combine two, actually. One question is, what roles do museums have in activism as an educational tool for schools? And another one is just wondering if there is any scholarship Amy could share on the relationship of an institution's activism and them functioning as a museum space and their impact on social change. Yeah. Do I need to repeat those, or?
No, let me see if I can remember them. So in terms of the first one about like schools and education and activism, often when I think about these museums and write about them, and I'm sure all of you who visited the museum in Montgomery had this thought, like in many ways, these museums are kind of preaching to the choir, right? Like people are choosing to visit them, people who most likely are sympathetic to the kinds of messages that they are conveying in their exhibits and narratives. But one big exception is school groups, right? So when school groups are brought to these museums, when kids visit them, I think there's potential for, education that maybe goes beyond the kind of echo chambers in which many of us spend lots of our time, for the youth to like learn about new things, right? And maybe these museums can challenge the way that they have learned or thought about the world that they live in. And so I think there is a lot of potential, but again, there's a lot of variation in how these museums, are like how accessible they are to schools. Funding is always an issue in terms of educational programs, and so some of them have like very robust education departments and programs, and others have virtually nothing. And so I think there's a lot of potential there, but I think it's sometimes untapped potential. And then I think the second question was about activism. Is that right? And like scholarship on activism?
Yes.
There is, so the like concept of like memory activism and museum activism is relatively new in, in the scholarship and in academia. But there's more and more of it. So it's like growing and is like really kind of growing quickly in terms of a field of study. There are a couple, there's a edited volume called Museum Activism that's edited by Sandel and Janes, I think, and that's a really good kind of starter for thinking about museum activism. There's a massive handbook of memory activism that was published by Routledge. It's massive. You can probably only get it in the library, but if any of you want like individual chapters or something, you can email me and I can try to get a hold of them for you, because it's like, I don't know, it's like that thick. It's got like 60 or 80 chapters or something. So there is like a growing literature, but I think a lot of it is still kind of grappling with the potential for these sites and spaces to engage in this kind of activism. As we also think about like where that could take us. So, and I hope my email was on the slide. I'm also super easy to find. So if anyone has questions or thoughts and wants to just reach out to me, you can just Google me and I'll pop up and you can send me an email.
Just one more question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, there are two, but I'll ask them together once again. I'm sorry. Do you think the lack of African American history and heritage sites are due to a lack of funding, resource, and support? And then another follow-up question by the same person. Do you think the framing of these sites as a reaction to civil rights have an impact on the narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes to both of those, I would say. I think, in this country, for so long, there has been, kind of a mainstream, historical narrative that has then shaped our historical sites and our commemorative landscape and all of it. And I think it has left very little room for other histories and stories. And so I think, I did that super brief history of African American museums, but, the first phase of museums were very much community projects, like, collecting funding from the community to create these like pretty small, like often kind of precarious institutions that were, in no way as stable, as established as, the mainstream museums that they were trying to counter. And I think that continues today, but I think it's changing. So like the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, of course, like much of its funding is federal, and we'll hope that continues. But it also, I think, had one of the largest fundraising campaigns. I think maybe at the time it was the largest Smithsonian fundraising campaign to raise money, to finish the museum and for its operating costs. And so I think that was a surprise to its creator, like a really pleasant surprise to realize that there is the capacity there for funding, and there's the appetite to see these sites that, tell these stories that haven't been part of the mainstream. I think there was another part of that question that I think I forgot. Okay. But yeah, I think we're still working on it, right? Like breaking down like the mainstream hegemonic narratives. But I think the museums that I've been looking at give us hope that this is starting to happen.
Thank you. Just want to thank Dr. Amy Sodaro for coming and giving us this enlightening presentation. Much thought to, much food to think about, and so much. It's been really eye-opening, so we thank you so very much. I know there were some questions that we didn't get to, but we'll try to get to them eventually. And I'll end with Dr. Laura Cohen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sodaro. Thank you so much, Dr. Sexton, for everyone that joined us today. We're witnessing in real time the dismantling of the Institute of Museum and Library Studies. Everybody was just let go. That's a huge funder for museums around the country and libraries. The same with the National Endowment for the Arts. The same might be for the National Endowment for the Humanities. So it's a really very stressful period, and thank you so much for your bravery in talking about this, and to everyone here at Queensborough for really engaging in a critical conversation at a moment of intense anxiety. So thank you on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. We hope you all stay safe during these challenging times.